Concrete scraped against bone, a sickening sound cutting straight through the chaotic noise of a crowded Sunday park. Two grown men, local heroes in their own minds, with the black belts to prove it, were supposed to walk all over the quiet, limping father who just wanted to cut his daughter's birthday cake. They didn't know they had cornered a ghost. This is what happens when street dojo arrogance violently collides with a decade of classified warfare. Sydney Wilson leaned against the splintering wood of the park pavilion, a plastic cup of lukewarm lemonade sweating in her hand. She watched her ex-husband Dilbert meticulously untangle a cluster of helium balloons. He worked with a quiet, methodical patience, his thick, calloused fingers moving carefully over the cheap ribbons. He favored his left leg when he shifted his weight, a permanent souvenir from a valley in Afghanistan that he never talked about. It was Cherish's 8th birthday. Their daughter was currently a blur of pink tulle and manic energy, chasing her cousins across the sunburned grass of Centennial Park. Sydney took a sip of her drink, the cynical edge of her mind taking inventory of the afternoon. Co-parenting with Dilbert wasn't a battlefield, but it was an exercise in navigating heavy, invisible silences. They hadn't divorced because of infidelity or shouting matches. They had divorced because Dilbert had come back from his final deployment hollowed out, leaving his capacity for civilian joy somewhere in the dirt of a foreign country. He was a good father. He was just a difficult man to live with. Dilbert secured the balloons to the picnic table and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his forearm. He wore a faded, oversized flannel over a plain gray t-shirt despite the July heat. He always wore long sleeves. It covered the ink, covered the scars, covered the past. "Cake's in the cooler," Sydney said, raising her voice over the ambient noise of a dozen different portable speakers clashing across the park. "We should probably do candles before the frosting melts into a puddle." Dilbert nodded. "Give her 5 more minutes. Let her run." He didn't look at Sydney when he spoke. His eyes were doing what they always did, scanning. It used to drive her crazy. Sitting in restaurants, he would track the waitress, the guy in the corner booth, the exits, the shadows. Now she just accepted it as an unbreakable loop of code in his brain. He was checking the perimeter of a suburban birthday party. That was when the heavy, aggressive rumble of a diesel engine shattered the low hum of the afternoon. A lifted matte black truck hopped the curb, tires chewing up the manicured grass, and parked entirely too close to the pavilion. The doors swung open before the engine even cut out. Heavy bass thumped from the cabin. Out stepped Greg and Todd Mitchell. Sydney recognized them instantly, and a knot of preemptive exhaustion tightened in her stomach. Everyone in town knew the Mitchell brothers. They ran a local mixed martial arts gym called Apex Striking. They were the kind of men who wore their masculinity like a cheap, overpowering cologne. Tight, moisture-wicking shirts stretched over steroid-inflated biceps, cauliflower ears worn as badges of honor. They carried themselves with a loud, aggressive entitlement, acting as if the town limits were the walls of their personal octagon. Greg, the older and noticeably larger of the two, hauled a massive cooler out of the truck bed, letting it drop onto the grass with a heavy thud. Todd followed, holding the leashes of 2 massive, unneutered pit bulls that immediately began straining and barking at a nearby group of teenagers. There were 6 empty picnic tables on the far side of the park, under the shade of the oak trees. Naturally, the Mitchell brothers bypassed all of them. They dragged their cooler straight toward the pavilion Sydney and Dilbert had reserved, dropping it less than 10 feet from Cherish's pile of wrapped presents. "All right, let's set up here," Greg announced loudly, tossing a folding chair onto the concrete. He didn't ask. He didn't acknowledge Sydney or Dilbert. He just claimed the space. Sydney felt her jaw tighten. She spent 40 hours a week managing a regional logistics office, dealing with inflated egos and posturing middle managers. She had zero tolerance for adult men who behaved like schoolyard bullies. She took a step forward, ready to point out the brightly colored reserved sign taped to the pavilion pillar. Dilbert's hand gently caught her elbow. The touch was light, But the unspoken instruction went absolute. "Let it go, Sydney," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. "We have enough room." She looked at him, frustrated. "Dilbert, we paid the city for this pavilion. They have the whole park." "It's a beautiful day," Dilbert replied evenly, letting go of her arm. He didn't look at the brothers. He looked at Cherish, who was laughing by the swings. "No reason to ruin it over 10 feet of concrete?" Sydney bit her tongue and retreated to the table. She knew why he was doing it. Dilbert abhorred conflict. To the outside world, to the Mitchell brothers aggressively cracking open tall boys of cheap beer and blasting abrasive rap music, Dilbert looked like a pushover. He looked like a middle-aged, out-of-shape dad with a bad knee who was afraid of confrontation. They didn't know that Dilbert's aversion to violence wasn't rooted in fear. It was rooted in an intimate, terrifying familiarity with what violence actually looked like. For the next 30 minutes, the tension simmered. The brothers were loud. They cursed freely, ignoring the dirty looks from other families. Their friends began to arrive, more guys in gym gear, a few women looking bored behind oversized sunglasses. The perimeter of Cherish's birthday party was slowly shrinking, swallowed by the expanding footprint of the Apex striking crew. Sydney watched Dilbert carefully cut a slice of pizza for a 7-year-old guest. His movements remained steady, but she noticed the subtle shift in his posture. He had moved from sitting on the bench to standing near the edge of the pavilion, placing himself squarely between the boisterous crowd of fighters and the children. His hands were tucked casually into his front pockets, shoulders slumped. He looked entirely relaxed, but Sydney had been married to him for 6 years. She saw the microscopic tightening of his jaw. She noticed how his weight was perfectly balanced, completely off his bad knee, resting on the balls of his feet. The dam broke when one of the Mitchell's dogs slipped its collar. The heavy brindle pit bull darted away from Todd, scrambling across the grass and plowing directly through the middle of Cherish's birthday setup. The dog wasn't vicious, just untrained and hyperactive, but it crashed into the folding table, holding the gifts. A stack of presents tumbled into the dirt. A glass pitcher of lemonade shattered on the concrete, splashing sticky liquid across Cherish's new party dress. Cherish shrieked, startled by the breaking glass and the heavy dog leaping around her. Sydney dropped her plate and ran toward her daughter, checking her frantically for cuts. "Are you okay, Cherish? Look at me. Are you okay?" Cherish was crying, terrified by the noise and the sudden chaos. Todd Mitchell finally jogged over, holding an empty leash. He didn't look apologetic. He looked annoyed. He grabbed the dog roughly by the scruff, snapping the collar back on. "Relax, lady," Todd sneered, pulling the dog back. "He just wanted to play. Your kid shouldn't be so jumpy." Sydney felt a hot spike of pure rage. She stood up, her protective instincts overriding her common sense. "My kid? Your dog just destroyed half our table and broke glass everywhere. Put that animal on a leash before I call the police." Todd laughed, a short, barking sound. He looked back at his brother and their group of friends, making sure he had an audience. "Call the cops over spilled juice." "Okay, Karen, whatever you say." Greg ambled over, holding a half-empty beer can. He stepped right to the edge of the shattered glass, leaning into Sydney's personal space. He was 6'3", easily pushing 240 pounds, radiating heat and cheap alcohol. "Is there a problem here?" Greg asked, his voice dripping with faux politeness. It was the tone of a man desperate for an excuse to explode. Before Sydney could respond, a shadow fell over the broken glass. Dilbert had moved. Sydney hadn't even seen him cross the 10 yards from the pizza boxes. He just materialized beside her, stepping smoothly between his ex-wife and the 2 massive brothers. "No problem," Dilbert said. His voice was soft, flat, devoid of any inflection. "We're just going to clean this up. But I'm going to have to ask you guys to move your setup back to the grass. You're bleeding into our reservation." Greg looked down at Dilbert. He looked at the faded flannel, the slight limp, the quiet, almost passive face. Greg smiled, showing straight, unnaturally white teeth. He thought he saw prey. The air in the pavilion instantly grew heavy, thick with the electric static of impending violence. The background noise of the park seemed to dial down, isolating the small circle of adults standing over the broken glass. Greg took a slow sip of his beer, his eyes locked on Dilbert. He didn't step back. He stepped closer, invading the invisible boundary of personal space. "Your reservation," Greg repeated, dragging the words out, tasting them. "Listen, buddy, we're holding a team barbecue. We need the concrete for the coolers. You guys have plenty of room over there by the trash cans." Dilbert kept his hands out of his pockets now, resting them loosely in front of his belt buckle. A casual observer would think he was fidgeting nervously. A trained professional would recognize it as an untelegraphed guard, hands perfectly positioned to protect the center line or strike upward. "I understand," Dilbert said, his tone still remarkably polite. It was the tone of a customer service representative dealing with a difficult client. "But it's my daughter's 8th birthday. We paid for the space. We'd just like to enjoy it in peace, please." Todd chuckled from behind Greg. Did he just say please? Sydney felt her blood run cold. She reached out, grabbing the back of Dilbert's flannel shirt. "Dilbert, don't. I'll just call the park ranger. Let's just gather the kids." Dilbert didn't move. He didn't look at Sydney, but he gently reached back and patted her hand. It was a grounding gesture for her, not him. "Walk away, Sydney," Dilbert murmured. "Take Cherish to the car. Start packing the presents." "Oh, the wife's calling the cops," Greg laughed, turning slightly to address his table of friends, who were now actively watching the confrontation, phones already being pulled out to record. "You hear that, boys? Suburban Commando here is sending his wife to call the ranger." Greg turned his attention back to Dilbert. He puffed out his chest, a classic primate display of dominance. "How about this, old man? How about you pack up your little juice boxes and you waddle back to your minivan because we aren't moving a damn thing?" To punctuate his sentence, Greg reached out and shoved Dilbert in the center of his chest. It was a hard, aggressive push designed to humiliate, a push meant to knock a weaker man off his feet in front of his family. Dilbert slid backward on the concrete, his bad leg dragging slightly. But he didn't fall. He absorbed the kinetic energy perfectly, bending his knees, letting the force dissipate through his hips rather than fighting it. He caught his balance immediately. Cherish screamed, seeing her father pushed. She broke away from her cousin and ran toward Sydney, burying her face in her mother's leg, sobbing hysterically. Dilbert heard his daughter cry. Sydney watched his face. For the first time in 6 years, she saw the vault door crack open. There was no cinematic grimace of rage. His face didn't twist in anger. Instead, everything human about Dilbert Wilson simply vanished. The apologetic, tired father evaporated. The muscles in his neck relaxed. His breathing, which had been shallow, dropped into a slow, rhythmic, diaphragmatic pattern. His eyes, previously warm and deferential, went completely dead. They were glass spheres reflecting the afternoon sun, calculating angles, distances, and vulnerabilities. It was terrifying. It was the face of a man who had made peace with the terrible arithmetic of survival, long before these two gym bullies had ever thrown their first punch. Greg, mistaking Dilbert's silence for paralyzing fear, stepped forward again. He felt the adrenaline spike, the high of bullying a helpless target. "What are you going to do about it, huh?" Greg taunted, dropping his beer can to the concrete. It clattered and sprayed foam over Dilbert's boots. "You want to go? You want to step on the grass and show me what you got?" Todd stepped up to flank his brother, a mocking grin on his face. "Careful, Greg. He might bleed on you. Looks like he's already got one foot in the grave." "Last chance," Dilbert said. His voice was no longer soft. It was a hollow, echoing sound, devoid of emotion. It sounded like an automated warning system, right before a detonation. "Walk back to your table." "Or what?" Greg roared, suddenly furious that this limping nobody wasn't cowering fast enough. Greg reached out, this time not to push but to grab. He aimed his large, heavily tattooed hand toward the collar of Dilbert's flannel, intending to grab the fabric, pull Dilbert into a tie clinch, and throw him onto the broken glass. It was a standard dojo bullying tactic, relying on superior size and sudden aggression. He never even touched the fabric. Violence, real violence, is not a choreographed dance. It is abrupt, ugly, and overwhelmingly fast. It relies on absolute commitment to breaking the human anatomy as efficiently as possible. As Greg's hand shot forward, Dilbert didn't block it. Blocking wastes time and energy. Instead, Dilbert simply wasn't there. He pivoted off his good leg, dropping his center of gravity by a few inches, and slipped to the outside of Greg's reaching arm. The movement was so fluid, so devoid of wasted motion, that Greg stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him past his target. Before Greg could realize he had missed, Dilbert moved. He didn't throw a closed fist. Fists break on hard skulls. Dilbert drove the heavily calloused heel of his right palm directly into the hinge of Greg's jaw, just below the ear. The strike didn't look like much, a short, compact 6-inch movement. But behind that palm was 200 pounds of torque, generated from the hips and delivered with the absolute cold-blooded precision of a man who had cleared residential compounds in Fallujah. The sound was a wet, heavy crack, like a dry branch snapping under a boot. Greg's brain violently rattled inside his skull. His equilibrium instantly shattered. His eyes rolled back to the whites before he even began to fall. As Greg crumpled heavily toward the concrete, his body completely limp, Dilbert didn't watch him hit the ground. A neutralized threat ceases to exist. Dilbert's eyes were already on Todd. Todd froze. For one agonizing second, the younger brother's brain short-circuited. He was a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He'd spent hundreds of hours rolling on padded mats, learning rules, tapping out when things got uncomfortable, waiting for the referee to reset the match. He was entirely unprepared for a man who fought to extinguish life. Seeing his massive brother dropped in a fraction of a second, Todd's gym instincts took over. He let out a yell, lowered his head, and charged forward, shooting for a double-leg takedown. He wanted to get this terrifying older man on the ground, where Todd was comfortable. It was the worst decision of his life. Dilbert saw the takedown coming before Todd even bent his knees. The telegraphing was amateurish. Instead of sprawling backward to defend the legs, the standard counter, Dilbert stepped into the charge. He brought his left knee up in a sharp, brutal arc. Todd, driving his face forward for the takedown, met the rising knee at the exact apex of its momentum. The sickening crunch of cartilage and bone echoed off the metal roof of the pavilion. Todd's nose exploded in a spray of crimson, his face flattening under the devastating impact. But Dilbert wasn't done. The rules of engagement dictated overwhelming dominance until the threat was entirely incapable of retaliation. As Todd's momentum was violently halted, his head snapping back from the knee strike, Dilbert reached out and gripped the back of Todd's thick neck with his left hand. He pulled the younger man downward, simultaneously driving his right elbow down like a sledgehammer, targeting the exposed collarbone. Another sharp crack. Todd let out a high-pitched, gargling scream as his clavicle snapped cleanly in two. Dilbert released his grip, stepping back seamlessly as Todd collapsed onto the concrete, joining his unconscious brother. Todd writhed on the ground, clutching his chest and ruined face, weeping openly, his tough guy facade completely pulverized alongside his bones. The entire physical altercation, from Greg reaching out to Todd hitting the concrete in a pool of his own blood, took exactly 4.2 seconds. Silence fell over Centennial Park. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. The rap music from the truck was still blaring, but nobody heard it. The men at the apex striking table sat frozen, their phones halfway raised, mouths agape. No one moved. No one rushed in to help the Mitchell brothers. The sheer, clinical brutality of what they had just witnessed completely paralyzed them. They had expected a brawl. They had witnessed a localized execution. Dilbert stood amid the broken glass. His breathing hadn't elevated. His heart rate, barely above resting, began to naturally downregulate the adrenaline. He looked down at his right hand, calmly brushing a fleck of Todd's blood off his knuckles against his jeans. He did a slow visual sweep of the brothers' friends. His cold, dead eyes lingered on them for 3 long seconds. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The message was clear. Anyone else? No one moved. One of the men slowly lowered his phone and looked away, suddenly intensely interested in his own shoes. Satisfied that the perimeter was secure, the shift happened again. The tension drained from Dilbert's shoulders. The cold, mechanical killer vanished back into the depths, and the tired, limping carpenter returned. Dilbert turned back to his family. Sydney was standing frozen, clutching Cherish to her chest. Her eyes were wide, filled with a complex mixture of horror, awe, and an undeniable, primal relief. She remembered the nights Dilbert used to wake up screaming, the nights he would sit by the window, staring into the dark. She finally understood, with crystal clarity, the monsters he had been keeping at bay all these years. Dilbert walked over to them, his limp slightly more pronounced now that the adrenaline was fading. He stopped a few feet away, mindful not to scare his daughter with his proximity to the violence. "Sydney," Dilbert said softly, his voice warm and human once again. "Is she okay? Did any glass get on her?" Sydney stared at him, unable to speak for a moment. She looked past his shoulder at the 2 massive men bleeding on the ground. Then she looked back at the quiet man in the flannel shirt. She's okay," Sydney whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Dilbert smiled, a genuine, tired smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small blue lighter. "Good," Dilbert said gently. "Let's light these candles before the frosting melts."